When you went to school, what do you remember learning about financial literacy? Did a bank person come out and teach you how to open a bank account or talk to you about a checkbook and what that is? I vaguely do remember this happening somewhere around, I'm going to say, circa 1991. But when I came out into the real world, 12 long years later, I had no idea what I was doing. I don't remember learning about mortgages, compound interest, loans, any of it. This is the issue of financial literacy. It's the ability to understand and effectively use various financial skills, personal financial management, budgeting, investing, those kind of things. You might remember learning maths and some foundational business principles, alongside your science classes, your home ec, all of that kind of thing. But did you learn how to balance your finances? How well equipped did you feel when you came out of high school? Now, the facts, sadly, are that somewhere along the line, women in Australia have fallen behind in a really big way. And their struggles with financial literacy in their adult lives can have some really dire consequences. So, what is being done to improve literacy rates and ultimately close the gap? Lelde Smits is a co-founder and executive director of investment consultancy firm The Capital Network. She also sits on the board of the Australian Shareholders Association. That's a not-for-profit that advocates for the rights of Australian retail investors. Lelde, why is this issue important to you?
Joel, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you thought back on and reflected on the experience you had at school and then asked how much of that prepared you for who you are as an adult. It's an experience that I think many Australians could relate to, and certainly myself. I had no financial literacy growing up, and I really started my adult life completely unprepared for the financial questions, from the very basic ones to bank accounts to the more sophisticated investing considerations or anything further, such as superannuation, was just not issues or topics that were covered in my formal education. And it was impacting my life, my ability to enjoy my life, to get in control of my finances and of my future.
You're absolutely right. And there's some very alarming research to support this. Now, I was looking over a recently released survey, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia, or the Lelde survey, and that indicates that women with an education level of year 12 or lower have a financial literacy rate of 38.3%. Why is this a thing?
You've really pointed out the large gender gap that is really here in financial literacy. But that same survey also says that over half of Australians really struggle with this, and more than 40% of Australians are financially illiterate. So why is that happening? Well, finance is filled with products, it's filled with companies, it's filled with people trying to sell you things. Whenever you're in a competitive market, there's often a complexity involved. And of course, recently we've had, certainly in the last 10 years, a proliferation of communication and sales on social media, which also becomes confusing to the community. It's difficult to know who to trust when there are so many voices.
Yep.
And these issues have really, I think, contributed to what was already a complex environment becoming more confusing for the everyday Australian who's just trying to understand how much money they have. Yep. And where they should put it, so that it's not only safe but grows for the future.
Why is financial literacy so important in the world we live in here in 2022?
Financial literacy on the base terms, yes, it's that set of skills that allows you to manage money wisely. And at a very minimum, these are skills that allow you to have basic numeracy, to understand essential financial concepts, and also to understand the trade-off between risk and return. But more broadly, when you look at why financial literacy is important, it's not just improving your life, it's improving the life of the community in which you live in. So when you have a community that understands broader concepts of financial literacy, they're making better judgments about their financial affairs, and they're also able to understand the relationship between their own finances and the wider economy. Almost in a way, how we have this consciousness about recycling now. When we recycle our own goods in our own household, it helps our whole community. In a similar way, when you are conscious of your own finances and responsible with your own finances, it's not just you that is impacted, but your whole community benefits.
Honing in on the female population, Lelde, what are the main reasons this is such a big problem for women in Australia?
Look, there are a number of reasons that women struggle with finances. And overall, when we look at society and between women and men, there has, of course, been inequality over the centuries and over history. And while financial equality may have progressed, this doesn't mean that equality has been achieved. Females are particularly disadvantaged, and these disadvantages are magnified if they're marginalised, such as being homeless. And this economic insecurity is really can be brought on by a number of factors. One of the factors is divorce. So divorce can completely destroy a woman's financial security. And that's why the fastest growing group of people actually facing poverty in Australia is women between the ages of 50 and 70. The pay gap between men and women that is very real. And also in many households, men still making decisions about pay. It means that women are just not at the forefront of making decisions about their finances. And then by the time they realise perhaps that they should be, in a way, it's too late.
That's very interesting. My name's Joel Spreadborough. I'm chatting with Lelde Smits. She sits on the board of the Australian Shareholders Association, a not-for-profit which advocates for the rights of Australian retail investors. We're speaking about the worrying gap in financial literacy in Australia. Now, Lelde, you've touched on an age group there. What are the risks for the women in Australia that are most affected? How dire can this be?
There have been stories that have come to light through the media. And as we said, of this high risk category of women that finish a working career and have had to have that working career interrupted either through having children or not contributing to superannuation, perhaps impacted by divorce, and get to their 50s and 60s and have no money and have not prepared to be in a situation, either thinking that a partner would support them or thinking that the superannuation they were putting away would be enough, and it isn't. And how dire are the prospects? Well, it really means that you're looking at homelessness, and you are looking at the opposite of financial freedom. Everyone, whether you're a woman or a man, if you do not embrace financial education, you have a lot to lose. I recently met a man who is in his late 60s and got divorced, and he had always, because he was the one that had earned the money, he allowed his wife to control the money, and he didn't even know the passwords of the accounts of the money that he was making going into the wife's control. And when they divorced, he was completely powerless, despite the fact that he had actually earned a lot of money throughout his life. He had no skills to manage the money. It's not about how much money that you make. It is about the skills that you have to manage the money that you have.
And what are the barriers that you can outline to this improving, to turning some of these numbers around?
Look, at whatever level we look at, it really is education. So we need to, at an early, if we look at the level of children, we need to encourage children and young adults to have conversations about money. We need to encourage women and men to discuss money in equal ways, and for it to be a conversation in a similar way that you have a conversation about your health, and in a similar way that fitness is not a destination that you reach, it's something that you work on every day. I think as a community and as families and as people that have relationships, money conversations need to become a lot easier to have. They need to become more frequent. And we also, as a result of those conversations, need to all develop a better radar between what is credible information and what is information that we may just hear at the pub from someone who is having a punt, but not necessarily in a position to give us good advice. And of course, in Australia, it's also really important to understand that we do have a financial services regulator, so that if you're looking for professional financial advice, you really need to be seeking out a professional that is a licensed professional.
Yeah, that's very wise advice. It's such a significant issue. I have to ask, how is this viewed by Australia's government, Lelde Smits?
The Australian government, I think, know that this is an issue. I mean, some of the stats that we read out earlier are really quite concerning. And, as recently as the last budget, the government said that they're going to give $7.1 million to really refocus the national approach to financial capability and drive these improvements in our system. Another thing I should mention as well, COVID has not been a friend for financial literacy. And it's really highlighted that there's never, because we've had so many households impacted by the pandemic, there's never really been a more important time for individuals to hone in on that skills and knowledge and support infrastructure to manage their finance as well. So the government is really trying to lift Australia's financial capability, and the pandemic has highlighted why that's more important than ever. The government just recently released that 1 in 5 Australians couldn't access $2,000 if they had to in an emergency. It is frightening to think that there are Australians that cannot access emergency funds.
You're listening to ABC Radio on your Sunday, and you're hearing from Lelde Smits. She's a co-founder and executive director of investment consultancy firm The Capital Network. She also sits on the board of the Australian Shareholders Association. They're a not-for-profit advocating for the rights of Australian retail investors. We're discussing financial literacy, and Lelde, I really appreciate the insights. Can you share some advice? You've given some advice already. Is there anything else you could say to it for an everyday Australian woman to help her take control of her own finances?
Staying where you are is always comfortable, and we know that. The world would be great if you could just stay where you are, but comfort doesn't necessarily mean empowerment or fulfillment or joy. And so I really encourage anyone to just make the decision and say, I'm going to embrace investing in myself. And to invest in yourself, one of the first things you can do is just make the decision. Secondly, is to embrace independent education. So there are independent resources out there that are not for profit, like Australian Shareholders Association. The government also has resources on the internet where they tell you in simple language, simple steps that you can take to empower yourself. But even if you say, look, I don't feel like reading any books today, what can I do, or any words, what can I do right now in this moment? Look, shares is something that we offer. Obviously, being at the Australian Shareholders Association, people ask us, how do I get involved? And it is actually more accessible than you think. For example, if you save $20 a week, after 25 weeks, you'll have $500. Now, that's the minimum parcel you can invest. And if you do this every 6 months, that's saving $20. And when you get $500, you invest. When you get to retirement age, you will have $1 million share portfolio. So many of us can visualize a $20 note, and your journey to investment and your journey to compounding interest on the share market can start really with as little as a $20 note and the desire to learn more about where your money is going.
Pay gaps, it's an ongoing issue. Is there any way that higher rates of financial literacy can help find parity when it comes to equal pay?
That's a brilliant question. And I think you would have to say education and transparency of finances will always assist when it comes to narrowing the gap and improving equality. One of the biggest problems we have had, I think, historically, when we look at finance, there's been very little transparency over where money is going. It has either been dominated by a particular gender or a particular class of society. And what we're seeing now, I think, is really a democratization of finance, in that in the past, for example, if you wanted to invest in a share, you may have had to have only done it through an advisor and apply to that person and go and see them in person. Now anyone can open up a share account. It is Finance is becoming more accessible to all. There's certainly more information than ever, which of course, as we discussed, can also be a problem if you're not seeking credible information.
Yep.
But I think the more we have these conversations, the more we put the facts and figures on the table and address them, the more that pay gap should narrow, and we should move to a society where all individuals, regardless of their gender, are getting paid what they should be paid,
Yep.
and being empowered on their finances.
Awareness is everything. Lelde Smits, I'm so grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for your insights.
Absolute pleasure, Joel. Thank you.